So good afternoon, and before we begin, may I say my name is Jane Caro, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting. I'm coming to you on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to extend my further respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are taking part in our webinar this afternoon. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, no matter what part of Australia you're actually sitting in at the moment. Now, this webinar is held to commemorate the 16 days of activism to highlight gendered violence. Well, there's an awful lot going on in that space at the moment, isn't there? It's organised jointly by DV New South Wales, the Women's Legal Service, Warringah Baya Aboriginal Women's Legal Centre, and the Inner West Region Elder Abuse Collective. It's supported by the Inner West Council and the Older Women's Network of New South Wales. And I'm delighted to be facilitating it. The focus of the webinar today is to look at the issue of coercive control and how older women are impacted by this insidious form of abuse. As you may be aware, on the 16th of November, the new legislation criminalising coercive control in intimate partner relationships was passed in New South Wales. However, the new offence won't commence until sometime between the 1st of February 2024 or the 1st of July 2024. This is to make sure there's time for the education of police, judicial officers, lawyers, and the wider community. Sounds like a very good idea to do some of that. This standalone offence will carry a maximum sentence of 7 years in jail. Coercive control is a pattern of abuse that may or may not include physical abuse, but is centred in control over another person, which prevents them having autonomy in their life. Indeed, as Jess Hill wrote in her wonderful book, See What You Made Me Do, it's like coercive controllers have all read the same playbook or been to the same training school. It's amazing how similar the patterns are. To discuss this topic, we are joined by, can you wave as I say your name so that everyone knows who's who? Kathryn McKenzie, who is the Director of Operations, the Ageing and Disability Commission. Welcome, Kathryn. Liz Snell, Law Reform and Policy Coordinator, Women's Legal Service, New South Wales. Rachel Martin, Principal Solicitor, Warringah Baya Aboriginal Women's Legal Centre. And Renata Field, who's managed to pop in, even though she was just doing a presentation a few minutes ago, who is the Policy Research and Advocacy Manager, Domestic Violence New South Wales. Hello, Renata. Welcome to everyone. They, of course, bring with them years of experience and will help us to understand the new legislation and how it relates to older women. You know, those people we never talk about, unless you are one like me. Please use the Q&A function to post your questions, not the chat function. We're happy for you to chat, but it makes it hard to track the questions. So if you put the questions in Q&A and the chat in the chat, that keeps everything nice and clean and easy to follow. So first up, let's get started. And I want to ask Kathryn first, because the Ageing and Disability Commission runs the Ageing and Disability Abuse Helpline. So I guess you hear a lot of stories. Can you please give us an overview, Kathryn, of the number of calls taken by the hotline over the past year and the type of calls? What percentage of callers are older women, and does coercive control, play a role in any of those calls? Who are the perpetrators? And if you have a couple of case studies about what happened and how the Ageing and Disability Commission helped the victims, that'd be useful too. That's a lot of questions as one, but just take what you can.
All good. Thanks very much, Jane. So the Ageing and Disability Commission, we operate the Ageing and Disability Abuse Helpline. Our main role is to take reports about older people and adults with disability who are subject to or at risk of abuse, neglect and exploitation. In the last financial year, the helpline received just over 12,500 calls. And that translates into just under 4,000 individual reports, or reports about individual older people and adults with disability. Most of the reports that we receive, about 3/4 of the reports, are about older people. So in the past financial year, that's a bit over 3,000 reports, and most of the reports about older people, so about 2/3 of those reports are about older women. So most of the reports are about older women, so a bit over 2,000 reports in the last financial year.
Wow.
So we receive reports about all forms of abuse, neglect and exploitation, mainly in their family, home and community settings, so generally not involving paid staff. And generally the reports tend to involve more than one form of abuse. It's very rare for us to get a report that only relates to one form of abuse. For older people, the most common concerns that are raised with us relate to psychological abuse, followed by financial abuse and then neglect. And most of the allegations in relation to older people relate to the conduct of their adult child or children. So a bit over half of the reports or the allegations, so about 52% relate to adult children, but more broadly, relatives are the subjects of allegation or the alleged perpetrators in about 60% of the reports that we receive about older people. Coercive control features in many, many reports about older people that we receive, and many reports to the Ageing and Disability Commission, and includes things like the older person being prevented from seeing the people that they want to see, including family members, being prevented from accessing the services and supports that they need, including aged care services, health services, aids and equipment that they might need, includes them not being having access to or control over their own finances, being prevented from accessing the community or only accessing the community under circumstances that are deemed okay by the alleged perpetrator, and generally they are with the older person the whole time. It involves the older person being verbally abused, including belittling, degrading comments, and a verbal abuse that's intended to erode their self-esteem and importantly, in relation to many of the older people featured in reports to us, it's also intended to erode their confidence in their own cognitive capacity and ability. It also involves the older person being threatened that they won't be able to see their grandchildren, or that they'll be placed in residential care, being threatened that their pets will be harmed or removed, being tracked or monitored. That includes CCTV or car and phone tracking devices, as well as kind of the more common forms of violence, I suppose, which are being hit, pushed, grabbed and shaken. The actions that the ADC takes in relation to these matters really depends on the particular circumstances of the older person, the factors involved in that matter, and, you know, vitally for us and in relation to our legislation, it also really heavily depends on the views and wishes of the older person, what it is that they want us to do and the amount of involvement that they want us to have. A core thing that we do seek to do is to talk to them safely away from the alleged perpetrator. You would appreciate that there can be some challenges with that, but we do have powers we can use to enable that if necessary. Typically what we find is that the older person doesn't want action taken against the alleged perpetrator because they're family members and generally, as I mentioned before, they're their own children. They just want the abuse to stop. So often what we would do is focus on actions to connect or reconnect the older person with supports and services that they need. You know, we find that line of sight, some level of line of sight over what's happening becomes really important for protecting the older person, and also provides a really important safeguard for them to be able to talk to someone away from, ideally away from the subject of allegation, but gives them an avenue to raise concerns and to get help if they need it. And we also focus on things like re-establishing connections to others, particularly family members that they want to be in contact with and that they've been prevented from contacting. Depending on the case, we might link the older person in with legal advice, advocacy support. We can work with them in relation to their finances to safeguard their finances as needed. We can report matters and do report certain aspects to police if needed. We may go to NCAT if that's needed. So it really kind of depends on the individual scenario.
Case by case. So who generally reports? Is it the person themselves, or is it health professionals, or is it other members of the family who are concerned? Where do you get the majority of reports from?
Yeah, most of the reports are not from the older person themselves. So around 12% of the reports are from the older person. Most of the reports that we receive are actually from adult children reporting on siblings or other family members, and also service providers. And the last financial year, actually service providers overtook adult children as the leading reporters to us in relation to concerns about older people. We've done a fair amount of work to get the word out there about the ADC amongst service providers. So it's great to see that a lot of reports are coming in from that area.
And I don't know if you know the answer to this, but it did strike me. Are these older people experiencing this kind of behaviour, abuse, control, etc., for the first time in their lives? Or is this an ongoing, they've had a relationship with a partner where this was common, that do you know the answer to that?
It really depends, Jane. It is really varied, I have to say. There are some that absolutely, and where the coercive control is by a spouse, where that has been happening for a long period of time. There are some, as you say, that may have been subject to that type of behaviour from a spouse, and now they're experiencing it from an adult child. But there are also some that are only starting to experiencing it once they start to become slightly more dependent on assistance, or there's an open door and I suppose an opportunity there that the alleged perpetrators are taking advantage of.
Thank you. Liz, you're working on policy in the Women's Legal Service, so maybe you're the best person to give us an overview of this new legislation, which presumably you'll be able to make use of, Kathryn, when you get cases coming across your desk that fit the profile. What does this kind of new legislation about coercive control mean for older women and elder abuse? What do people need to look for so that they can ring the hotline and report if need be? And are there any problems with the legislation, do you think? Again, you get a laundry list of questions.
Thanks very much, Jane. And I too want to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from beautiful Bidjigal country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge First Nations colleagues joining us today, as well as survivors who've joined us too. As you say, the New South Wales Parliament has passed a law which will create a new standalone offence for a course of conduct of abusive behaviour perpetrated in an intimate partner context. And as you've already indicated, the new offence won't start until the 1st of February 2024 at the earliest, and must commence by the 1st of July 2024 at the latest. And as you've said, Jane, there is so much work that needs to be done, including the training of police, lawyers, judicial officers and the community. That's a reason why there's the delay, and it's going to be the Coercive Control Task Force which will recommend to the Minister when the offence should start exactly. In terms of what people need to be looking for, there are 5 elements that need to be proved to establish this offence. So the first is that the alleged offender must be an adult, so 18 years and older, but I do note victim survivors can be under the age of 18 years. The second element is that the alleged offender and other person are or were in an intimate partner relationship. The third element is that the alleged offender engaged in a course of conduct of abusive behaviour. And by course of conduct, what that means is engaging in the behaviour repeatedly or continuously. And abusive behaviour includes violence, threats or intimidation of a person, or coercion or control of the person. And there's a non-exhaustive list of examples of that in the legislation. The fourth element is that the alleged offender intends the course of conduct to coerce or control the other person. And the fifth element is that a reasonable person would consider the course of conduct would be likely to cause the person to fear that violence will be used against them or another person, or a serious adverse impact on their capacity to engage in some or all of their ordinary day-to-day activities. So there's actually quite a bit in there that has to be proved in order to be able to establish this.
One red flag that stood out to me straight away in terms of what Kathryn was saying, and in terms of older women in particular, is intimate partner, given that so many older women outlive their intimate partner, and their coercive controller may not be their intimate partner. So that was almost saying this legislation does not cover older women in that circumstance.
Exactly, Jane. The older women will be covered, as you say, if they're in an intimate partner relationship, but it does not cover the other forms of elder abuse by, for example, adult children, by other family members who aren't intimate partners, or by carers, amongst others as well. So yes, and when you asked me about what were some of the shortcomings of the legislation, absolutely, that was one of the concerns that have been raised. Indeed by other groups as well as older people, so First Nations communities, culturally diverse communities, and people with disabilities as well. But importantly, as part of the review provisions for this legislation, there is a review provision that in 2 years' time, 2 years after the commencement of the legislation, there will be a review, and one of those review provisions is to look at, should it be expanded to include broader than intimate partner violence? So yes, absolutely, that is a gap, and there will be further opportunities to continue to improve on the legislation. In terms of other limits, certainly during the debate on the bill, and now legislation that's passed, the mental element, and that is about the intention of the course of conduct to cause physical or mental harm to the other person. There was much debate about that, and whether or not it should actually, rather than focusing on the intention of the course of conduct to coerce or control the other person, or whilst having that aspect, the aspect that's missing is a recklessness. So in the draft legislation that initially came out, it was about intending the course of conduct to cause physical or mental harm to the other person, or being reckless as to whether or not the course of conduct may cause physical or mental harm. What that basically, by not having a recklessness element in there, it means it's actually going to be, in our view, quite difficult to prove the intention of the alleged perpetrator in regards to their intention to coerce or control. So that's another shortcoming, and another aspect that's in the review provisions to determine whether or not that can be improved further down the track.
Well, of course, it immediately makes me think of this idea of people not acknowledging, oh, I thought there was consent in sexual assault cases. It's all about what the perpetrator thought, not about how the victim was experiencing the abuse. So we're doing the same thing with this. We're saying, oh no, he was trying to protect her by taking control of her finances and not giving her any money. Well, they'll get off scot-free then, won't they? That's very worrying.
Yes. There are quite a few other concerns, but I'm mindful of time.
Well, thank you. We might come back to that if we have some time. Renata. No, sorry, Rachel is my next port of call. Sorry, Rachel. 2 R's following each other are confusing me. You deal on the front lines with Indigenous women experiencing coercive control in the community. Can you tell us how older Indigenous women experience coercive control, and did you identify with some of the problems that Liz was pointing out in terms of the legislation that we can already see, and are there more that we haven't thought about yet?
Yes, thanks, Jane. I also want to acknowledge that I'm coming from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging. And I also wanted to acknowledge all the Aboriginal women that have survived horrific violence over the years, and I wanted to acknowledge their incredible strength and resilience, and to acknowledge any Aboriginal people on this call today. Basically we share out the concerns that Liz has already highlighted. Our centre work very closely with Women's Legal Services and Domestic Violence New South Wales and the Older Women's Network on all of these, on the Coercive Control Bill. We collectively advocated for lots of change, And so everything that Liz has said applies to our centre. In terms of what Aboriginal women experience, they definitely experience what is described as coercive control. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about that term is, as we would all, I think many of us would say, all forms of domestic violence is about coercive control. And so there's just a spectrum of behaviour. And so I think what the bill is trying to capture is that those non-physical forms of domestic violence. So we'll use that term coercive control because it's just easy to use it for the terms of this discussion. So Aboriginal women certainly experience all forms of domestic violence. They certainly experience psychological abuse, financial abuse, social isolation, spiritual and cultural denigration, being refused to participate in cultural events or spiritual or events, or that their spirituality is being denigrated. It occurs in both intimate partner relationships, but very much it also it occurs in relationships with other family members or carers. And that message was we certainly heard that message from a lot of the women that we spoke to, that they want this offence to apply to broader range of relationships. So we certainly have that concern. One of the big concerns, I suppose, that we had about the bill to begin with was that we say that there's a whole heap of cultural and system reforms that need to take place before the offence comes into effect. And that's because we have concerns about the legal system and policing of domestic violence. And there's some research that shows that some recent research that shows that Aboriginal people were grossly overrepresented as offenders, in particular offences that are, that what you could describe as, I suppose, coercive control offences, so stalking, intimidation offences. There was an extraordinary overrepresentation of Aboriginal people, which was very concerning because it showed that something is going wrong. And I mean, in terms of our service in Aboriginal communities, we have been saying this for a very long time, that Aboriginal communities are over-policed, but also that often Aboriginal women are misidentified as being offenders rather than actually being correctly being identified as being victims of domestic violence. So we wanted the government to take time to significantly improve legal systems, policing system, to make sure that when the offence came into effect, that what we wouldn't see is Aboriginal women being misidentified as being as being offenders rather than victims of violence. So we looked at, and I mean, as rightly has been pointed out, there is some delay in the offence coming into effect, but we would like to have it seen to be much longer lead time, to be honest. Because Aboriginal women want to be protected. They want to see protection from the legal system, but they want to make sure that the legal system is fair. So when the system is ready for this new offence, then they will be very happy for this offence to come into effect. But we say there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And as Liz talks about, there's a task force that's going to be overseeing that the implementation and the monitoring, but there's concerns about who's going to be on that task force as well, and I don't know how much you want to go into today in that discussion about the task force. We need to make sure that the right people are on that task force and that there's real and genuine consultation with the right people, and and very broad consultation, including with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across the state, to make sure that they get it right.
Absolutely, thank you very much. Renata, to you. What's the experience of workers dealing with matters of coercive control amongst older women? And interestingly, we were talking before, I was asking Kathryn about, have many of these women grown old with violence and therefore would find it difficult to use this legislation because they've it's become almost normalised. And do you think the community more generally is ready to view coercive control as domestic violence? What do you think, Renata?
Thanks, Jane. I would like to acknowledge the country that I'm on, which is the lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And thank you so much to Rachel for sharing your knowledge around Aboriginal communities. And thanks to the other panelists. It's great to be here and to be in this conversation. So I represent Domestic Violence New South Wales, which is the state's peak body for domestic and family violence services. We have approximately 130 NGO sector services across the state. So that includes women's health centres, legal centres, refuges, etc. I would very much agree with Kathryn that the experience is very varied. I wouldn't be able to generalise it as in any way that people come for support in a variety of different ways. And the services that we represent also support people at different parts of their life course. So you might attend a women's health centre for a different reason than you'll be accessing a crisis accommodation service. But across the board, there's coercive control. I very much agree with Rachel, is the centre of domestic and family violence. It's not a form of domestic and family violence as we understand it. I think people don't suddenly murder each other out of nowhere. There's, you'll occasionally see resistance type violence that's not as a part of a pattern of abuse, but the majority of domestic and family violence that we see is part of that pattern of abuse. And I think certainly there's a lot of people, young or old, who've we are in a society that unfortunately normalises violence, and there's a lot of societal, cultural factors that enable violence to occur, and perpetrators of violence utilise that in ways that can silence and minimise the violence, but they're obviously very clever in using ways to using systems, using those kind of social norms to allow violence to happen and to be perpetrated in continuum. I think something to add to Liz's fantastic summary of the legislation is that it won't be retrospective because it's difficult to get people to be apprehended on a crime that they didn't know was a crime at the time. But what that I think will mean is that from the time it becomes legislation, that's when the pattern of abuse begins. So for somebody who has had a 30-year history of domestic and family violence, the coercive control, that pattern of abuse, which would beginning, it would be beginning from that time. Correct me if I'm wrong, Liz. But I think that it's certainly the cultures and the community norms that enable and minimise domestic and family violence in all situations which allow it to happen. And that's something that we can all be part of, and we certainly are today by shining a light on it through this forum.
Thank you, Renata. To everyone, really. We've spoken about Indigenous women. What about working with women and older women from cultural and linguistically diverse backgrounds? Do you have any stats, Kathryn, on whether there's how many of reports you get from people from that kind of background?
Yeah, Jane, we get overall, in terms of reports to us about older people, about 8% relate to older people from called or multicultural background. I mean, we know that that's, significant underreporting, and that's a priority area for us to increase reports from multicultural communities. I mean, there's many reasons why there is underreporting, including of coercive control, amongst other kind of forms of abuse, neglect and exploitation, including that it can be really hidden, coercive control in particular, because of, in many cases, that nature of isolating the person. The activity is intended to isolate the person from others and from the community. It can be hidden, particularly if there's no other kind of line of sight. over what's happened, and matters kind of kept within the family. But there's also what we see in a range of matters is there are aspects of shame, not wanting to raise issues, particularly where it involves family members, issues relating to not knowing, fear of raising concerns or raising the issues, not knowing what would happen if they did that. And also there's an element of, the trusted people for those older people within those communities, the people that they trust, also not necessarily knowing what to do in response to that information can all be really significant factors.
And Liz, what about, I would imagine that visa status is something that could worry a lot of women from those kinds of backgrounds who might be in a very vulnerable situation. Don't want to tell anyone in authority.
Absolutely, Jane. That's certainly a barrier, and there's so much that needs to be done in that space in terms of barriers to accessing services and support, and not being eligible in some circumstances for services and support. The other issue that I'd also comment on too is that, as Kathryn said, so much of coercive control goes unreported, and particularly unreported to police. So I think another thing that's really important too is about a co-responder approach to domestic and family abuse. And by that, we mean specialist domestic and family violence services that are also culturally safe, co-responding with first responders such as police, to helping in terms of improving police response to domestic abuse as well. And we do acknowledge that 5 co-location of specialist DV workers in police stations, but I think our understanding is that they're only 9 to 5 business hours, and they really need to be 24/7, and they need to be teams of specialist DV workers. So a fantastic start, but we'd love to see it expanded further, because we think there's we know from the PACER model with mental health workers working with police that's worked really successfully. So a co-responder model is a really important approach.
And that also brings us, and you've already mentioned this, Rachel, to the issue of racism and how that affects the way police and other authorities deal with reports of domestic violence. Rachel, do you want to talk about that from an Indigenous perspective, but perhaps also more generally about the kind of stereotyping that we do, which gets in the way of people getting the support they need?
Yeah, indeed. And so, for Aboriginal women, it's not just about being misidentified when reporting violence, and it's also about when it's also not being respected and believed as well. So it may be the response is not that they are charged, but there's actually no response, that there's indifference, that there's dismissal because of what they're saying. And the reality is that there is both conscious and unconscious bias amongst police officers in our state. And that's not surprising, because there is racism generally in our community. And where do police come from? They come from our communities. So it's just a given that there is racist views, and it can be, so the racism can be overt, and it can be subtle. And so it can be as obvious as asking the person if she's Aboriginal, and therefore dismissing it and saying, well, if you're look, I'm not attending, or this view that it's normalized within that community, within that relationship, therefore there's no point us doing anything about it, because invariably that woman will go back to her partner, for example. It could be that that the other example could be, for example, that if it's things around financial abuse or poor, that there's this, particularly for an Aboriginal woman, say who's in a relationship with a non-Aboriginal man, that the non-Aboriginal man is believed more, that he comes across as articulate, in control. His explanation for behaviour is, well, I need to do this because I need to run the household. which is tapping into, you know, racist views about Aboriginal women and Aboriginal people generally not being able to manage their finances, being poor parents, and therefore that non-Aboriginal person needs to perform those duties because there's this view that Aboriginal people can't. They're poor parents. They're poor with money, and so what the perpetrator there is clearly tapping into those biases, whether it be conscious or unconsciously held by police officers. And as I said, the fact that there's BOXAR, Bureau of Crime Statistics research that shows that in offences in relation to stalking, intimidation, extremely high numbers of Aboriginal people being charged with those offences compared to non-Aboriginal people shows a problem. And so therefore, that's a fundamental issue that we think that needs to be addressed. That if you're going to, I mean, and an Aboriginal, of course, experience both racism and sexism, and at the same time, there's an intersection between sexist views and racist views. And if you truly want to respond to Aboriginal communities properly and to truly protect Aboriginal women, then those racist and sexist views at the same time need to be addressed.
Absolutely.
You can't separate them. They come hand in hand.
And a huge range of negative assumptions that go with both. Renata, moving slightly to the sexist assumptions that underpin all of this. When Rachel was talking, the word that sprang into my head as she was talking about the way that we regard Aboriginal people as parents and as financial managers, and is also similar to this idea that women are often seen, particularly if they're being coercively controlled, as crazy. She's crazy. Is a very strong trope amongst coercive controllers to delegitimize anything that someone who's suffering this kind of abuse might say, and particularly with older people, but particularly older women, the idea that they have dementia, they have Alzheimer's, therefore they're imagining it, they're exaggerating, etc., which is made doubly worse, as you point out, Rachel, if they're women of colour or Indigenous women or women with a disability who's experiencing this. How do we deal with that ageism intersecting with sexism and in some cases also with racism?
Should be able to nut that out
Come on.
in the next minute. No worries. Look, we do need widespread systems and cultural reform. I spoke to the sort of more broad shifts that we need across the whole of the community, and that primary prevention work is something that we can all absolutely be part of. But I think in this context, we're speaking specifically or most particularly about the justice system. And I do think that if we only address sexism, we're not going to get to the bottom of the problem. I think the most recent national plan is a great example of that demonstrates that the intersectional issues impact all of us, but we do need to address ageism, we do need to address racism, sexism, ableism, and make the systems that are set up to support people safe, really, and that means safe for everyone. And I think if we can make them safe for Aboriginal women, if we can make them safe for older women, if we can make them safe for people with disabilities, then they're going to be safe for white middle-class women too. So that's a bonus. But I think there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done, and I'll do a shameless shout out for the Action to End Gendered Violence platform, which is in my background, but I'll pop it in the chat, but people can sign on to support that. And that is an election platform that many of us are part of as the New South Wales Women's Alliance, and it does call for broad cultural changes to the systems that support people experiencing domestic and family violence, and that includes the education system, justice system, health system and the support sector. And we do really need a huge amount of training and investment to ensure that people are getting a high quality response. It doesn't matter their age and background, but they need to be getting it wherever they go. And so if we can focus on people with those specific more particular needs, then we can make it safe for everyone. So I will pop that into the chat and would love everyone's support.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, because I'm also reminded of the fact that the Older Women's Network have just put out a terrific video about sexual abuse of older women, which is a rate of 50 a week in aged care. And yet I was thinking about the assumptions made by some police that were reported recently about how a woman complaining about sexual assault, they thought she was too ugly, you know, couldn't, all this stuff. And you think about older women and the kinds of assumptions that must be being made about that kind of thing as well. So it is really, isn't it, about this way we pigeonhole people as part of a group rather than looking at them as their individual and unique selves and respecting them as such. Now, I'm aware that we've got just over 15 minutes left of our precious time. And so I'm thinking we might go to some questions. We've got quite a few in the Q&A that I can see, and we've already had 2 come in advance, which I'll quickly take you through. The first one is from a 77-year-old woman with a disability. She's living alone, and she's now being bullied, she says, for the last year by a young neighbour on one side, and 3 weeks ago abused and intimidated by an elderly, she's Greek neighbour, on the other side. She found a man, a friend of her Greek neighbour, in her garden up a ladder, about to cut down a branch of one of her fruit trees. The tree was not overhanging the fence. She was shocked and frightened. The man wouldn't leave. And then the neighbour started abusing her, saying things like, "That's why you haven't got a husband, because you're a bitch." He threatened to come in whenever he wants. He's been poisoning some of her plants. She rang the police. They didn't come. They arrived 4 hours later, and the neighbour told police he'd been allowed to come into the garden for 40 years to help her. So I can hear the crazy already being tossed around. She then heard they won't proceed with the trespassing charge, saying it's her word against his. And she heard about seniors' rights, and she's proceeding with a PVO against the neighbour. She's put CCTV cameras in. She asked, do you often hear of situations like this? And are there any suggestions to manage it? I'm too old to move and start again. And I don't know how to deal with my nasty neighbours. I mean, we don't think about that when we think about things like this. And yet, I imagine neighbour disputes are one of the most common forms of difficulty. And older women particularly vulnerable, I would have thought, older people in general. Any comments on that? You're on mute, Kathryn.
Just muted myself for no reason. Sorry about that, everyone. I guess I would say in relation to that experience, unfortunately, isn't isolated, and that experience that unfortunately that she's had with, the neighbour indicating that, it's not abusive, or it's not, there's nothing wrong with that conduct because, in fact, I'm providing support to the older person, is such a characteristic of our matters. And as Liz flagged earlier, it is a real concern in terms of the legislation that is being brought in. In our view, there is too much scope for, particularly in our cases, whether it's a spouse or family member, if they were picked up, to be able to say that, well, I'm doing it to manage risks to the older person or to protect them, and I'm doing it in the context of providing care to them. It's too easy for that. We see it on a regular basis that's an accepted form of explanation, and not a lot of questions that are asked in response to test that. So unfortunately, that is not uncommon experience. She's done the right thing in raising that with police, and also that contact with Seniors' Rights Service. That's fantastic, and exploring that option to have an order to protect her. I guess the other elements there may not be appropriate for this situation, but we do see with neighbour matters, often I guess not necessarily involving abuse, but where mediation can sometimes be effective, particularly where they are disputes like the type that are characterised there. The helpline can also provide assistance to link into that, and can also provide advice and information. So yeah, I'll provide a bit of a link to the details of the helpline, but I mean, she's done the right thing in the response there.
Great, thank you. Anyone else got a comment before we go to another question? Okay. The one thing that struck me is it's very symbolic of how when you lose respect and status, your boundaries, your own psychological boundaries, but even the boundaries of your own home become permeable. People feel they have the right to cross them. You suddenly don't have that ability to say, no, this is my space and you can't invade it. That in fact what's going on is that's no longer regarded as legitimate and your space can be invaded by anyone who wants to, which makes it quite an interesting kind of metaphor for what's going on. Here's a second question we received in advance. Coercive control is being discussed in the public arena. However, the discussion is in the context of, and I think this is a good and accurate observation, context of coercive control against the younger demographic, or information seems to be more directed towards that cohort. How does education read elder abuse and coercive control? You've already pointed out the legislation almost explicitly excludes elder abuse from this, in part so that it reaches elder people who are often isolated, can't afford technological devices, or are disadvantaged financially and can't access support. Liz, do you want to take that one on?
Sure, thanks, Jane. Acknowledging that there are shortcomings in the offence, which is yet to I think there is value in looking beyond the criminal legal system, and so that we all get better at responding to coercive control in all its different forms and how it impacts on different people, including older people. So whilst I acknowledge the shortcomings of the criminal legal response, I actually think that there is a role for there to be education about how coercive control impacts on different communities, including for older people, and that it would be useful that if that education is developed and co-designed with the involvement of older people, as with different target groups, whoever the target group is, and there are opportunities for training for people to engage in training. I realise that there are some difficulties because obviously police are limited with the legislation in how they can respond to things. There are some existing laws, as we've seen with reference to your earlier question, there was access to a personal protection order instead of the domestic violence order. So there may be some existing legislation, but I think as a community, we need to better understand these issues and have much more access to education that's developed and with input from people from that particular target group.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, that's useful. Anyone else want to comment on that question?
I just wanted to add that I think that it's great that there's already been an investment in some community education to go alongside this. But people may or may not be aware that Tasmania actually has an offence as well that came into place in 2004. So we're not the first people to be doing this, but what they learned was that because the police didn't know how to do it, the community had no idea about it, it was basically not used. So they had less than 200 convictions in 15 years. So I think the community education is a huge piece of this. And like Liz said, it should be directed and co-designed by community for community. I think that a really important part of the legislation is that there's a definition for the first time of domestic violence, but it includes financial abuse, and we're yet to see how that may what that might look like in practice. But for older people, we know that financial abuse is often co-occurrent as part of the abuse. So hopefully, best case scenario, it will create better legal avenues to deal with that. But regardless, having more community education about elder abuse, family abuse, and financial abuse, I think will be really helpful.
Great.
I think too, Jane, from our end, the legislation only kind of partly addresses the broader issues that we're seeing in our matters, but this is a really good opportunity to, use the momentum to really get out there to talk about coercive control. A lot of service providers aren't aware of what it involves and the signs of that. So there's a really good opportunity there to raise awareness in the broader community, but also those, I guess, trusted people that may be in contact with older people, and that there are options not just about associated with the legislation or just associated with police. There's a range of other options for getting assistance.
And just alerting to people to the fact that what's being done to them is wrong and is illegal. I mean, I think that makes a huge difference. This is a really oh, sorry.
No, just very quickly, I'm conscious of time. I think in terms of community education, we need to be creative about how we do it, and so any community education campaign needs to be at a very local level, and we need to know we need to identify where we can reach people and where we can reach older people. So it's identifying the places that they go, the places where the services that they may have in contact with, and reaching them that way rather than having some big statewide campaign that's very generic and it's not adapted to the needs of cultures, of age groups, and all the local community. Because for example, we know with Aboriginal communities, they're different across the state. There's no uniform Aboriginal community, and what's happening in rural areas and is very different to what's happening in Metro Sydney areas, but even across in rural areas, that they are different again, and that their sources of information are different from community to community, and that's what we need to identify. How do we reach people?
And it is difficult, and I imagine limited funds, so there'll be all of that. I will, however, give a little shout out to the creative community, of which I've been a small part. There's been a spate of novels and films and things about coercive control and domestic violence, which I think actually is a really good way of getting the message out in ways that people don't even know they're getting a message. But I've had feedback, for example, from people saying, oh, I didn't realise that what was being done to me was coercive control. And therefore, if something had come out about education for coercive control, they would have regarded it as irrelevant to them. So there's other ways that we could perhaps get creative about in terms of getting messages out generally about what this stuff is and how you might be experiencing something and not even aware it has a name. And now legislation pending. I've got a number of other questions. This one I think is really interesting, and so we might get two in, but I'll try this one first. What about religious coercive control? We've read a bit about this. Julia Baird has done some quite illuminating work in this area, but I guess this is where one assumes that church communities have very rigid rules about female behaviour, perhaps. And how do you help people in that situation? Go on, somebody risk it. You're all on mute, I notice. You're all laughing away. We can't hear you.
I can't see the question, Jane. Sorry, but is the question about the religious institution controlling?
It just says, what about religious coercive control? I've literally read it to you word for word.
Yeah, right. So I mean, it could include, for example, for Aboriginal people, it's being denied to practice your cultural, your culture or your spirituality. So that's definitely part of the spectrum of behaviour. It could also being coerced to practice the religious view or a practice of the perpetrator. So it can be all that. And I mean, in terms of religious institutions, any big institution is not immune from patriarchy. So it's about, I mean, this is a personal view, so that's obviously about challenging, you know, patriarchy and challenging deeply sexist views and norms about how women should behave. But certainly, sorry?
I was thinking specifically as you were talking about reproductive coercive control, either forced to terminate pregnancy, for example, or take contraception, or not allowed to terminate a pregnancy or to use contraception. That would be one area where religious justification might be used for a form of coercive control.
We've certainly seen in some of our matters, sorry, Liz, certainly seen in some of our matters where older people have come in contact. So again, with kind of trusted parties for them that they've met through religious events or through religious connections that then have kind of entered their lives, moved into their homes, and then have absolutely exercised coercive control over the older person, and using that kind of trusted relationship as a foray in. So certainly do see that in a range of our matters. Yeah.
So like anything else, it can be used as a justification, or it could be used as a way of helping someone and helping them to fight back, giving them comfort and pastoral care, real pastoral care. Anyway, it's a very interesting question, I thought. I'd love to ask another one. This is very quickly. It sounds like an impossible standard to meet of proof and enables DAVO use by perpetrators. Please comment. Why bring in legislation with so many deficiencies and shortcomings that mean that many victim survivors are not classed in IPV, are excluded and not protected until at least 27, 28 after a review period? Wouldn't it be better not to bring it in at all unless fit for purpose?
I'm happy to kick off on this one, Jane.
I think it sounds like you, Liz.
I think it's an excellent question, and certainly one with which we're engaging with throughout the introduction of the exposure draft and finally the piece of legislation that came before Parliament. And is indeed why, picking up on what Rachel was saying, we have been advocating, really, our preference would have been for having much more time to do a lot more of the cultural and systems reform work that we've been talking about, and for that to happen before we introduce an offence. And if we could have the time, and we don't think 15 to 19 months is actually going to be an adequate period of time for the offence that's been proposed as it stands, and in fact is an arbitrary time. There's no mapping out of all the work that needs to be done and the time frame for which that it needs to be done, and yet we've landed there. So we would have liked much more time, and then in part of that much more time, having legislation that did immediately, well, I shouldn't say immediately because we didn't want it to come in immediately, but when the legislation is introduced, that it was going to be more inclusive of beyond intimate partner violence. And certainly there was a lot of advocacy at the time talking about that and asking for it to be delayed so that there could be that cultural systems reform work that happens, and then when the legislation was eventually introduced, that it was more inclusive of those different areas. I do acknowledge that Marsha Scott, who's the CEO of Scottish Women's Aid, who did a lot of work and worked with many others in introducing the criminalising of domestic abuse in Scotland, which is the equivalent of coercive control. She has said that in honouring the suffering and the courage of those who took on the issue of wanting to criminalise domestic abuse, it begins by knowing that we're going to get it wrong. But that our biggest learning is going to be from how we got it wrong. So be ready to implement robustly, assess mercilessly with the input and feedback from the coalface, and amend, and then try it all over again and repeat. So we have the legislation that we have. For many of us are thinking now that there's a lot of work that needs to be done with the implementation task force. And I know that Rachel picked up on that issue before. One of the things that we were advocating for was that there be an independent task force. We don't have an independent task force. The legislation provides that there are 4 members of the task force. It's chaired by the Secretary of the Department of Communities and Justice. It's got a representative of police. It has the chair of the Domestic and Family Violence and Sexual Violence Council. And then it has an NGO representative from a DV with expertise in DV service delivery. So one of the 4 members is an NGO. Then the government recently announced there will be 4 more additional government agency members. So Health, Aboriginal Affairs, Multicultural, New South Wales, as well as Legal Aid New South Wales. We would say that 1 out of 8 now being NGOs. We think that there needs to be a recognition of the strength that more DV service members could bring, and the strength too of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community representatives and other priority populations and people with lived experience can bring.
I was going to say survivors.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there are reference groups, but the reference groups operate differently to the task force, which is why we're saying the membership of that task force is important, and why it's important we've got regular reviews. And also during the debate, there was a lot of talk about what should be included in the reviews. So there was the advocacy was successful in getting a whole range of additional issues included in the reviews, including how effective is the definition of domestic and family abuse in the Crimes, Domestic and Personal Violence Act, which was another part of this review that doesn't get much attention, which is what governs the apprehended violence orders, and including how effective is the education in changing police response to domestic and family abuse, amongst many, many other reviews. So I do take the point that, you know, that many weren't happy with the legislation, but it's a constant, this is a legislation that we will have. It's important. We want to work with government to make it work as best as it can, but our focus is on constantly the continuous improvement that's going to be needed, and the importance of that implementation task force and the monitoring and evaluation moving forward.
Thank you very much, Liz. I think that's very comprehensive, and I take your point about the perfect being the enemy sometimes of the possible. Which is an improvement on nothing. Unfortunately, we are 4 minutes over time, which is to my bad. So I'm going to have to say thank you so much, Kathryn, Renata, Rachel and Liz, for all your thoughtful, candid and expert comments. I've certainly learned an enormous amount. And can I also thank everyone who has attended the webinar. It has been recorded, so people who weren't able to come will be able to catch up on what's going on. I'm sorry we couldn't get to every single one of the questions, but we did get to as many as we could possibly squeeze in. Thank you for those. And thank you very much for all the organisations who are involved in this, and for everyone who has been an activist in working to get to this stage where we actually have a law, imperfect or not, that is bringing this particular form of abuse, form of domestic violence to the fore, and getting it attention that it badly needs. Let's hope we iron out the wrinkles, make it inclusive, and begin that work that Rachel was talking about, of recognising each individual rather than stereotyping groups. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, Jane. Thanks, everyone.